Story number 1. Hollowbrook Asylum had been abandoned for 50 years. The town had long forgotten the horrors that took place inside, but the building still stood, rotting on the outskirts. Yet whispers persisted about a patient who never left. Eric, a paranormal investigator, prided himself on debunking myths. Armed with his camera and flashlight, he ventured into the asylum one cold night. The air smelled of mold and decay, and broken wheelchairs and rusted bed frames littered the halls. He found a dusty patient log at the nurse's station. Skimming through the pages, his fingers stopped on the final entry. Patient 237 remains unaccounted for. Do not open room 6A. Eric's heart pounded as he scanned the hallway numbers. Room 6A was at the very end, its door somehow untouched by time. No dust, no peeling paint. He hesitated, but curiosity overpowered fear. The door creaked open. Inside, a frail man in a hospital gown sat on the floor, his back against the wall. His skin was sickly grey, his eyes hollow. Slowly, he turned to Eric and grinned, revealing blackened teeth. "Finally!" the man rasped. "Someone to take my place!" Eric's body stiffened. The world blurred, his vision tunneling. He tried to scream, but his voice was gone. The next morning, Hollowbrook remained as empty as ever, but room 6A's door was shut once more, and inside a new patient sat, his camera lying dusty at his feet. Story number 2. Blackwood General had been abandoned since the 1980s. Patients had vanished, swallowed by the hospital itself, or so the rumours claimed. Noah and his friends, thrill-seekers with a love for urban exploration, decided to prove the stories wrong. They entered through a shattered window, their flashlights flickering as they stepped into the darkness. The hallways smelled of mildew and rust, old medical charts scattered across the floor. Noah stopped suddenly. The walls, they were moving. At first it was subtle, a barely noticeable shift, like the building itself was taking a slow breath. But as they moved deeper, the walls pulsed, rising and falling in a sickening rhythm. "Guys, do you hear that?" A faint, wet sound echoed around them, like something slithering beneath the plaster. Then a whisper, "Help me." The voice came from a room at the end of the hall. They hesitated, then stepped inside. A gurney sat in the center, its restraints fastened. Then a man's voice, ragged with terror. "They're inside the walls!" The plaster ripped open. Hands, faces, bodies pressed against the surface, stretching the walls like a living prison. Noah ran, but before he could reach the exit, a cold, fleshy hand burst from the wall and dragged him inside. His friends ran, screaming, but as they reached the street, the building stood silent once more, the walls still breathing. Story number 3. Dr. Langley had once been the pride of St. Mary's Hospital, brilliant, meticulous, and utterly devoted to his craft. But when patients started disappearing, the hospital's reputation crumbled. It was only after St. Mary's was shut down that authorities searched the abandoned facility. In Langley's private operating room, they found only one thing: an empty surgical table covered in dried blood. His whereabouts were never discovered. Years later, Lisa and Mark, two medical students, decided to explore the hospital for a school project. They entered through the old emergency ward, marveling at how eerily intact everything was. The hospital was frozen in time. Rusted stretchers still in the halls, yellowed patient files still stacked on desks. Then they found the operating room. Everything inside was pristine. Surgical tools lay in neat rows, an operating table freshly prepared, as if waiting for a patient. A single clipboard sat at the foot of the table. Lisa picked it up, her breath catching. It had her name on it, and beneath it, a list of procedures, ones she had never undergone. A metallic scrape echoed behind them. Lisa turned. A figure in a tattered surgical mask loomed in the doorway, holding a gleaming scalpel. "I never got to finish my work," the doctor rasped. The door slammed shut. Overhead, the surgical light clicked on. Mark pounded on the door, screaming Lisa's name. Then silence. Days later, authorities investigated after reports of screaming from the hospital. They found no one inside, but in the operating room, a fresh set of organs lay in a sterile metal tray, perfectly preserved. Dr. Langley's work was never finished. Story number 4. St. Vincent's Orphan Hospital had been left to rot for decades. No one spoke of the children who once lived there, nor the night they all vanished without a trace. Dan, a paranormal investigator, wanted answers. He entered the hospital late one evening, camera rolling. Dust coated the floors, but the old nursery looked almost untouched. Tiny beds lined the walls, stuffed animals sat waiting, and a single rocking chair creaked in the corner. Then the laughter started. It was faint at first, just a single giggle, then more. A chorus of children's laughter echoed through the room. Dan froze. A cold breath tickled the back of his neck. He spun around. A group of children stood in the doorway, their clothes tattered, their eyes hollow. "You're not supposed to be here," one whispered. Dan staggered back. The room had changed. The beds were full. The children looked alive. Nurses walked the halls, their faces blurred. He was no longer in the present. He had stepped into their time. He turned to run, but the door had vanished. The next morning, Dan's cameras were found in the dust-covered nursery. The footage showed him talking, reacting, begging for help, but the room was empty, except for the sound of laughter looping endlessly in the dark.
Story number 5.
When Danielle, an urban explorer, found the old St. Augustine hospital, she expected dust, decay, and maybe some eerie graffiti. What she didn't expect was the 4th floor, because according to all records, the hospital only had 3. The building had been abandoned for decades after a string of unexplained deaths. With a flashlight in hand, she entered through a broken window. The air inside was thick with mold and the scent of antiseptic that had long since faded into rot. Wheelchairs sat motionless in the hall, some facing the walls as if they had been abandoned mid-movement. As she wandered the halls, snapping pictures, she found an old directory sign bolted to the wall. It listed 1st floor, emergency 2nd floor, maternity 3rd floor, surgery 4th floor, isolation wing. Isolation wing. That wasn't in any of the hospital's blueprints. Determined, Danielle climbed the stairs. But when she reached what should have been the top floor, she found another staircase, one that hadn't been there a moment ago. Something was wrong. The 4th floor was pristine. Unlike the decay below, this floor looked untouched. The lights flickered, but remained on, illuminating rows of pristine white beds with yellowed, restraining straps still attached. The air was heavy with the scent of something unnatural, a mixture of antiseptic and sweat. As she walked deeper, she felt an odd pressure, like someone was watching her. Then she noticed it. The doors were closing behind her. One by one, each patient room sealed itself shut, as if unseen hands were slamming them closed. The hallway stretched longer, and the lights above buzzed erratically. Danielle turned to run back, but the staircase was gone. A soft, shuffling sound echoed from the end of the corridor. She turned her flashlight toward it, and her breath hitched. A gurney was rolling on its own, its wheels squeaking against the tiles. Something was lying on it. A figure wrapped in old, blood-stained sheets began to sit up. Its movements were stiff, unnatural, as if its bones had been broken and twisted back together. The sheet slipped off its face, revealing a hollow, skeletal grin with empty sockets that leaked black fluid. Danielle screamed. The lights flickered off, and the last thing she heard before darkness swallowed her was the squeaking of the gurney rolling toward her. Story number 6. Nobody knows why Ridgeview General Hospital was left to rot. One night, the staff and patients vanished, leaving behind a fully stocked building, as if they had simply stepped out for a moment. Mark, a structural engineer, was sent to survey the crumbling building before it was demolished. He expected mold, water damage, and collapsed ceilings. He did not expect the walls to be moving. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he walked deeper into the surgery wing, the walls seemed to pulse like they were breathing. Then he heard it, a heartbeat. Distant at first, then growing louder, thumping through the walls like a massive, unseen heart. Mark shined his flashlight down the hall and froze. The hallway was changing. The pristine white tiles rippled, shifting into something fleshy, red, vein-like growths crawling up the walls. The hospital was alive. A doorway on his left suddenly split open like a gaping mouth. Something long and wet slithered out. He ran. Doors melted into the walls as he sprinted past them, his only escape route twisting, turning, closing behind him like the walls were digesting him. The heartbeat grew louder. He burst into an old operating room, where a single rusted surgical table stood in the center. The moment he entered, the door disappeared behind him. Then, the lights flickered, and the doctors appeared, or at least what remained of them. Gaunt, eyeless figures in blood-stained scrubs stood around the table, their skeletal fingers clutching rusted scalpels. Their movements were wrong, like puppets being pulled by invisible strings. One of them pointed at the table, and then the hospital spoke. "Lie down," Mark screamed. Story number 7. Decades ago, Blackwood Asylum was a place where the mentally ill were sent to be forgotten. The worst cases were kept in Ward 6, a special wing deep in the basement. When the asylum was abandoned, Ward 6 was sealed off. The doctors had fled overnight, leaving their patients locked inside. Ryan, a journalist investigating urban legends, ignored all warnings. He crawled through a broken window and stepped into the damp corridors. Water dripped from the ceiling, and rusted gurneys lined the walls, their leather straps still fastened. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. He found Ward 6's entrance, a rusted metal door with deep scratch marks on its surface, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. Inside, the cells were still occupied, not by the living, but by their remnants. Scattered patient records, overturned chairs, and disturbing scrawls on the walls told a story of people who had been abandoned, left to starve in the darkness. Then the whispering began. At first it was a faint murmur, like wind passing through cracks, but then he heard words. "Help us." Ryan turned, heart pounding. The cells were empty. The doors were swinging slightly, as if someone had just stepped away from them. A sudden clang made him whip around. One of the metal doors had slammed shut, on its own. Then another, and another. The whispers turned to screams. Shadows shifted unnaturally at the far end of the corridor. He saw them, figures with sunken faces, their mouths open too wide, their hands stretched toward him. Then he felt it. Cold fingers wrapped around his wrist. Ryan ripped away and bolted, dodging slamming doors. But just before he reached the exit, he saw something worse. A single wheelchair sat at the center of the room, and it was turning toward him.